So a couple summers ago, and I've talked about this author here with you before, but I read Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises. And I remember lying in bed, it was very hot, which is why I was awake, still reading, and finishing the book, which is always a good feeling. I read more to learn than I read for pleasure, and so anytime I can be done with it, that's a very good feeling. And finished the book, and I remember laying there thinking about, well, I wonder exactly what that was just about. To me, it seemed like a story about friends experiencing the complexity of life together, the ups and downs, and the uncertainties, and even going after the things you expect, etc., etc., etc. But I was curious to see what other people thought about this book. I obviously knew it was famous, but I was curious, what are some of the other opinions, reviews, etc. So I turned to Google and did some hunting on the reviews of this book, and I was surprised, very surprised in fact, to discover that the book was actually a criticism of the expatriates, American expatriates living in Europe after the First World War, and particularly a criticism of what's called the Lost Generation, which was a bunch of American artists and authors and poets that were living in places like Paris and other parts of Europe after the First World War. So people like Hemingway and T.S. Eliot and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein and people like this. And so I noticed pieces of that in the book, but I did not realize that Hemingway was writing this as a criticism of some of their misplaced ambitions and failures and disappointments, etc. And had I known that that's what he was trying to accomplish, I probably would have read the story slightly differently. And I think that that experience is the experience that many Christians have with the story of the Tower of Babel. It's somehow simultaneously one of the best known and least understood stories in the Bible. I think we know what the story of the Tower of Babel is about. People built a tower, God got angry, so he messed up the languages and he scattered them all over the earth. But there is much more to the story than that. Much more to the story than that. Like the Garden of Eden and the flood before it, Babel is one of three major rebellions in the Old Testament that essentially set the stage for everything that comes after. Just to give you a sense of how this will work, we will be in Babel next week, and then immediately the next chapter after this, we are introduced to Abram and to the call of God's people and to this massive redemption plan that starts to come about. And so you've got Eden, you've got the flood, and then you've got Babel. Major rebellions, major catastrophic rebellions, but a story that we don't really know much about. And so we want to know about it because knowing about it helps us to understand God's much larger plan to reclaim his human family and his commitment to his divine desire, which was to have a family, which is why he made us. So our text this morning is primarily Genesis 11, 1 through 9, and then we will move around a little bit, but primarily just the text on Babel. So we'll read from there, beginning in verse 1, chapter 11. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So we're going to jump right into our first point this morning, which is just this, that rebellion and pride ultimately built contempt. Contempt for God. So Genesis 11 begins by describing this world where people speak the Same language, one single common language. And in unity, they decide to settle in the plains of Shinar, and then in unity, they decide to build a city and a tower. And it's possible to read just that and go, well, that's not so bad. What's the big deal? To our Western culture that values ambition and excellency and accomplishment pretty much higher than anything, well, this seems innocent enough. They're just getting things done. Maybe it's even admirable. What could be so wrong? And so the problem lies not so much in what they did, but why they did it. This has happened repeatedly through the Bible story. It's not so much the what, it's the whys. And so we're going to talk about two major whys for a moment. The first why is because they wanted to build a name for themselves. They wanted to build a name for themselves, which would indicate a fairly strong desire and passion for self-glorification. There was a prideful ambition to replace God's fame, God's glory, God's renown with their own. And what they wanted was for their name to be spread across the earth, their name to spread across the earth, the knowledge of their accomplishment, the knowledge of their glory spread across the earth, rather than the name and the knowledge of God, which is what they were actually supposed to be doing. Now, how do we know that they were supposed to be doing that? Because if you go a couple chapters back, after the flood dries up and Noah and the gang emerge from the ark, God gives them a new mandate, and he says to them something he said to Adam and Eve: be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Fill the earth. Fill the earth as people who know God, who know that he's in charge, who desire a relationship with him. Fill the earth. And yet this group determines to do the exact opposite. They determine to settle, not to fill the earth, to settle in one place and to build and to bring God to them rather than taking God, so to speak, everywhere. Now, the second reason they built the city and the tower is so that they wouldn't be spread across the earth. They didn't want to do that. So this was a direct attempt to stay exactly where they wanted to be and not do what God asked them to do. We'll just stay here. We read it very clearly in verse 4. And this is an act of defiance. It's an act of rebellion against God's mandate for people to make the earth once again something like the Garden of Eden, a place that was full of the knowledge of God, and God was delighted to walk with his people, and people were delighted to walk with God. So though the tower is this structure of brick and tar, their pride and rebellion ultimately leads them to build this tower of contempt. It's a tower that's a symbol of their disrespect and disregard of God and his authority and his glory and his own name. C.S. Lewis summarized the event like this, and lots of people have summarized the event. It's not that this one's necessarily particularly better, it's just this one's nice and concise. He says, the builders of Babel desired to make a name for themselves. They sought the heights of heaven but neglected the foundation, which is submission to the Creator. Pride always leads to a fall. Now, in addition to what the text tells us, the tower itself, what this thing was, helps us to understand a little bit about what these people were trying to do, and again, why that offended God. So the tower is believed by most scholars to have been something called a ziggurat. There's a picture of it, something like this. And so it was a stepped tower, usually capped at the very top by a temple. And so they were almost like temple mounts, to be honest. And they were architectural marvels in Babylon. In fact, we have another picture. You can go to the next one. This is actually one that they found in Ur, which is where Abram is from. So we can say God is going to call Abram out of this context, out of this culture, and look, they found one of these bad boys right in his hometown. And so how they did this was through really advanced bricklaying techniques. And so even when you read that they said, oh, we'll take bricks and we'll bake them and we'll use tar, they then built these as these like symbolic mountains where they would connect earth to heaven. And the Babylonians believed that if they did this And God came down into their little special place that then their relationship with the divine would be controllable. And these structures would actually be like a box to put God in, and to control him and control their relationship with him, to control when he showed up and when he didn't show up. And so at Babel, humanity is attempting to bridge the gap between heaven and earth, which isn't such a bad thing. That's God's heart. But they're not doing it according to God's will and according to God's instruction. They're doing it through their own strength and their own pride. And that's a pretty amazing thing, really, for God to say, hey, I will create an earth, and I will come and walk amongst people, and it will be this thin place where heaven and earth intersect, and it's going to be beautiful for my creation, and it's going to be good. And then humans go, it's not great, but we will make our own, and we'll come up to you. That's how we'll do it. Like, that is like the most human thing. That is so what we see in our own hearts and our own pride. Is God, we like the idea, not bad, but we'll just tweak it slightly, just give ourselves the upper hand in this dynamic. We'll do it our way. And so this is, again, this attempt to give them glory on the earth and draw people to them rather than being scattered. We'll get others to come and see us. It's like they built this celestial circus, and their fame would know no end. And so, as I've said, this is the opposite of what God mandated people to do. He said, I want you to fill the earth. I want you to increase in number. Spread out and spread my knowledge, the knowledge of me. But they stay put, build up, bring God down, and fill the earth with the knowledge of their own greatness. So, once again, common theme, humans reject the mandate of God, do their own thing, and God responds in justice, with justice. So rebellious sin caused them to face the very outcome that they were trying to avoid, which in and of itself is a lesson for us right there. Often in our own human attempts to control outcomes, we'll at times sin through mistrust or controlling God or doing our own thing or direct disobedience. And then the thing that happens is we face the thing we were trying to control anyways. It's like I'll control everything in my world because I'm anxious, and then it all falls apart and my anxiety leads to a nervous breakdown because I tried to control it. Right? So it's this tendency in humans to rebel in such a way that then we actually face the outcome that we're trying to avoid. So they try to stay put. Let's just stay here. And then we read that God's judgment is that he scatters them from there all over the earth. And they stop building the city. This is why it's called Babel, because he confused their language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So it's a swift response to the rebellion. God confuses the language. He makes it impossible for them to communicate and work in unity. And he scatters them across the face of the earth. The consequence is the thing they were trying to prevent. And so this leads to an important question. Why did God scatter them? Or rather, even more importantly, how did God scatter them? What's going on here? What's behind God's mind and his heart? Was it just to disrupt their plans so they wouldn't do this again? Or is there something more at work here? And so to understand the scattering of the nations, we need to actually do what we've done often in this series so far, is look at other biblical texts that comment on this event. And this is the problem with the story of Babel. If I were to ask this room, where else do we learn about Babel? Most of us don't necessarily know. We didn't even know there was another place to read about the story of Babel. So we're going to turn to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. Moses comments on it. And this gives us insight into what's happening in the scattering. Beginning in verse 8, chapter 32, it says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to what? The number of the sons of God. Oh. Now, before I explain this, I want to acknowledge if you read this in your own Bible, even if you're following your own text right now, there's a very good chance that where this says sons of God, your Bible will say sons of Israel. That's a poor translation. Sons of Israel is not accurate. The first reason it's not accurate is because at the time of Babel, Israel didn't even exist. Israel didn't come to exist until they've called Abram, and then Abraham has descendants, and Isaac and Jacob, and then Jacob gets called Israel. God didn't divide them according to the sons of Israel. Secondly, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are these ancient documents that were incredibly well preserved, that contain the entire Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, they don't have sons of Israel in this passage. They have sons of God. Now, we've talked about sons of God in this series. If you haven't been here for all the weeks, you may not remember what sons of God means. So I'm going to give you a really quick reminder because I don't have time to go into all this again. When the Bible talks about sons of God, it's often talking about other divine beings. It's talking about what is called the Elohim. So the best way I can describe this is I can say, we should go into the world and find mom. And I could be saying in that instance, find my mom, but I could also be saying we should go out into the world and find moms. Find the thing that is mom. Okay? So in the Bible, this word Elohim sometimes is translated as God for Yahweh. It's we worship Elohim. But other times, Elohim's just used to describe divine beings, lowercase gods, quasi-gods that are part of God's divine counsel. And this is the primary use of sons of God throughout the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular, is these divine beings, lesser gods that are part of God's, what's called his divine counsel. And so what this is saying then is that it means God in his judgment of the Tower of Babel divided humanity into nations, and he signed these nations to members of his divine council, the sons of God, those who help him rule in heaven just as humans help him rule on earth. And so each nation then would be governed by a spiritual being, a lesser God. But Israel, the nation that did not yet exist, God would choose as his special portion. Wow, that's actually pretty amazing. That all the rest of you can be governed by all these lowercase gods, but you are mine. I will be your God, and you will be my people. At this point in the biblical story, God is entirely fed up with humanity's consistent rebellion against his plan. And so from Eden to the flood to Babel, people just keep seeking to be their own God. And so at Babel, God essentially hands humanity over to the guardianship of the nations, to these lesser beings. He essentially disinherits the earth, the people of the earth. He gives them away. He puts them up for adoption. He places them in foster care. And he allows the government of these nations to be done by these lower beings, and he will be Israel, over Israel. So this actually is the biblical explanation for why other nations began worshiping other gods. Because it was a direct result of the judgment of Babel. Fine, you don't want me? Have at her. And it remains still to this day a valuable lesson for us because often people sin, right, to protect, prevent, and control. And often the judgment is to face what we are trying to avoid. They want to stay put, they are scattered. They wanted to be God, they didn't want to worship God, so God gave them away to lower gods. Fine. There you go. And it wasn't better for them because these lower gods failed to rule well. They failed to do a good job. They failed to do it like God would desire, which leads to even more chaos on the earth. So the sons of God ruled as rebels. We're going to flip now to Psalm 82. This is one of the key passages on understanding God's divine counsel of these lowercase gods. So God presides in the great assembly, and he renders judgment among the gods. And how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless and uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. So what you're getting here is God is starting to go, you guys are failing miserably. And then he starts to say, and this is what you should be doing. So how long will you defend the unjust? How long will you show partiality to the wicked? defend the fatherless and the weak, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Then he says, the gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But then here's judgment now on these heavenly rebels. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. So imagine a CEO who entrusts to a group of managers the task of running his company. But instead of promoting growth and fairness, they embezzle money and they exploit workers and they cause chaos. And then the CEO steps in and he fires them all and he takes back control of the company. In a similar way, that's what God's doing here. He steps in and he judges the managers that he had placed over the nations when they failed to rule justly. And just like there have been constant problems with human rebellions on earth, there were problems with heavenly rebellions as well. And these spiritual beings who were given authority over the nations failed to rule justly. And that's what Psalm 82 is. It's a glimpse into the reality of the failed lowercase g gods. And so God holds a divine council. He calls people together and he rebukes the gods for their failure to rule according to his justice. How long will you judge unjustly? How long will you show partiality to the wicked? What he's doing here is he's accusing these quasi-gods of allowing the nations to walk in darkness and promises that they will be judged and stripped of their immortality. So the rebellion of the divine council explains why the nations have continued to worship false gods even to this day. But it also helps us understand the purpose behind God's decision to bless the nations once again through one person, Jesus Christ. Because God is at times unexplainably merciful, like honestly, unexplainably merciful, he decides again to bring back to himself those who've rejected him repeatedly. He goes, I'll still go after them. So it starts with Israel, starts with Abram, and it continues all the way today into the new Israel, the church, where we are still part of this reclamation project. Now, that's all very information heavy. That's far closer to what you're going to get in a classroom than maybe a traditional Sunday sermon. So what I want to do now is just review what I've talked about in a summary, in a concise little tight explanation, and then we'll move on to a couple more broad pieces of this story. So this is like our breather, if we can even have a breather in this one. Michael Heiser, who has guided so much of this series, we'll turn to him. He describes these events like this. Up until this point in the story, God was dealing with humanity as a collective whole. That changed at Babel. Human beings would be segregated by language and geography. Even worse, God divorced himself from humanity. Fed up with human defiance of his will, God assigned the nations of the earth to other members of his supernatural family, the sons of God. This was a different group than those who transgressed before the flood. If you remember the Nephilim week, we also have divine rebellion in that story too. God couldn't kick humanity out of his house. He'd done that already back in Eden. He'd promised not to destroy humanity after the flood, so there'd be no repeat of that disaster. So what else could he do? He essentially said, enough. If you don't want me to be your God, I'll assign you to some of my heavenly assistants. And the fallout of this judgment took many forms. We aren't told how long it took, but the Bible tells us that the supernatural sons of God assigned over the nations did a lousy job. They became so corrupt that God had to judge them too. He would one day take away their immortality and take back the nations. So that's what Babel's about. It's more than a prideful tower building narrative. It's more than a moment where God scrambled the nations and it was crazy. It's one of these major rebellions that literally turns the world into divided according to a cosmic geography. So Eden was a rebellion. The flood came to wash away rebellion. And now the nations are scattered and disinherited by God. But the story isn't over. We're only at Genesis chapter 11. God would remain committed to his desire for a family. And he would accomplish this reclamation project through Abram and Moses and David and eventually Jesus. In other words, the story of the Bible tells us that this is a story of God reclaiming those who rejected him. Reclaiming those who rejected him because he's merciful and gracious and at times unfathomably kind. We could say this then of the gospel as we start to think in a bit broader perspective even into the age that we live in, which is the church age, and thinking about Jesus and his impact, which in one way is that we're jumping ahead, but I think it's important here, is that the gospel is like a remapping of the world. And so it's hard to imagine, but if you think about the world before Columbus or Magellan or Drake, these Europeans believed that the world was complete, that their maps were done. The known world was Europe and parts of Asia and Africa. That was it. And so then you've got the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492, and then that changes the understanding of the world. Entire continents are revealed. New trade routes are established. Global interaction surges for better and worse. New diseases are born and spread. New countries and territories are mapped and named, again, for better and worse. But whether it should be celebrated or condemned, I don't care. That's not the point of this discussion. But those centuries, 15th and 16th, were about remaking the world map. And that's what Babel did. It changed the map of the world. It changed the geography, but not according to brave explorers, but according to members of the divine council. And what those maps show was territory, and this is really important, was either holy because it belonged to Yahweh, or it was not because it was under the authority of a lesser God who was ruling with wickedness. And the ground you lived on determined which God you worshiped. If you lived in the Holy Land, as we like to call it, you were supposed to worship Yahweh. That was the God over that nation. And if you didn't live there, then you worshiped another God, like the Babylonians did and the Egyptians did. And, church, people knew this. This isn't us just reading backwards and going, oh, I see what's going on here. People knew this. So an example of this is found in 2 Kings chapter 5. And in that story, what we find is there's this guy named Naaman, and he's a Syrian commander. So he is not an Israelite. He's a Syrian commander. And he's healed of leprosy by the prophet Elisha's ministry to him. And after his healing, Naaman's like, oh, this is great. I want to keep worshiping this one true God because look what he's done for me. But then he asks to do something very strange. He says, based on this healing and based on the God who did it, I would like to take 2 loads of dirt back to Syria with me. And the reason that he wanted to take 2 loads of dirt back to Syria with him is because he understood that Israel's earth was holy. That Israel's earth was set apart and it belonged to the one true high God. And so he said, if I can take this dirt with me, then I can be on Israel whenever I need to worship Israel's God. Even though I live in Syria, I'll have a little piece of Israel with me. And that thinking carries on all the way into the New Testament. This idea of cosmic geography, Paul got this big time. He speaks of rulers and authorities over specific regions in Ephesians chapter 1 and Ephesians chapter 6. And he understood, this is the Apostle Paul again, that the world was divided into territories ruled by hostile spiritual powers. And then Paul believed that through Jesus Christ, God was taking back the nations for himself. That's for a sermon still to come. But the point is that Babel led to a map of the world according to the sons of God. And today, the gospel, through God's special possession, is involved in remapping that world. So here's the sermon in a sentence for today before I give us some actual practical application. In the Tower of Babel, human pride and rebellion led to their scattering, but God's greater plan was to reclaim all nations through his commitment to his human family. Now, I confess to you that this sermon was not the easiest to prepare, and wrapping it up is even harder. How do you put a pretty bow on this? Go and do likewise. What? So I wasn't really quite sure how to conclude it, and I'm still not sure that how we're going to conclude it is the best, because I don't know what the best way is. But I trust that God's going to use this last little consideration here today in your hearts and in this room and in this church. So a few years ago, I read a story about a current rabbi. He's quite controversial. And he has sort of a radical, probably controversial, approach to marriage counseling. So his thesis on marriage in the Western world is that we've done a terrible thing by making marriage essentially built on only commitment. That marriage actually has to be built on tension, where there's the risk that we could lose one another. That jealousy is actually helpful at times in our marriages because it makes us protect the marriage. So working off of that thesis, he's working with a couple who is struggling in their marriage. They're struggling in all forms, communication, their relationship, they're struggling with their intimacy, all these things. And so he comes up with this particularly radical exercise where he invites this couple to dress up, get really sharp, look really good, and head out to a bar and then sit apart from each other. And what he asked the husband to do was sit and watch as men hit on his wife. And as he sat there and watched that, jealousy, passion, appreciation, desire, to keep it PG, began to rise in him again. And as the story goes, they didn't even make it home. The car became a place of new covenant. Is that for Mitchell, Shauna? Because I can help you. Yeah. Interestingly, God describes himself as jealous for his people. And he's watched as generation after generation have been led astray by rebellious lower gods. And those lower gods have become the object of their affection and their appreciation and their desire. He's watched as his creation, which is his ultimate desire, his great passion, run after others. And they've pursued just about everything else. You know, if you want to understand what happened at Babel and you don't quite get it, read Romans chapter 1. And what you'll find is that in that chapter, I think Paul writes at least 4 times, God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. And he says things like, he gave them over to their futile thinking. Fine, you want to think that way? Think it. He gave them over to strange lusts and desires. You want to lust after that and behave that way? Go do it. And he gave them over, and he gave them over, and it says that they began to worship the created things rather than the Creator. And he's watched as his creation has desired other things and loved them and built their life for them and on them. And this is essentially what happens at Babel is God says, you don't want me, then go. Go. And the funny thing is at times in our, because we're kinder than God at times in our minds, it's like, why would God disinherit his people? How many of us would stick with someone that treated us like this? Oh, God's not kind. I thought he loved. He gave them what they wanted. That's the scariest thing, is that God will give people what they want. And yet, as the people are rejecting him, that's when God says, but I am jealous for you. And in this separation from God, this is fascinating. Paul says in Acts 17 to the Athenian philosophers, he says that in this separation, that we would search for God and find him, though he's not far from any of us. So we have a God whose heart is jealous for his people, and we have the separation of the people who are going, I think I'm missing something. And so if we take the event of the Tower of Babel and then we look at our own life as individuals, and we distill this and boil this down to just me and my stuff and my mind and my heart, I think we have to say, we have to ask, in what ways have we attempted to force God to come down to our level? And what are the towers in our hearts in which we have expected God to come down into that tower? What are our ambitions and our wisdom and our preferences that we have expected God to dwell in? Our Temple Mounts. Furthermore, if our hearts are one of the places where Jesus said, I will make my home there, I will dwell there, then we want to ask, what are we loving more than Jesus? And I ask that because if our heart, the territory of our heart, is not dependent on geographical borders or even biology, but on which God is Lord there, then we want to ask, who are we worshiping? Or, maybe better, whose territory is our heart? Who does our heart belong to? Who is Lord over this region? Because that's going to determine if that's holy ground and sanctified ground or not. So is it ourself that's Lord? Is it our habits? Is it our control? Is it our order? Is it our anxiety? Is it our fear? Is it sex? Is it alcohol? Is it money? Is it possessions? Is it our reputation? Is it being needed? Is it church? Is it family? Is it our children? Is it our grandchildren? Is it our spouse or significant other? Is it our education and our career? Is our heart a holy land? Is it set apart as God's, or does it belong to another? And I cannot answer that for you. Sometimes that's hard to even answer for me. But I know that it matters. And if it remains hostile or enemy territory, there's good news. The good news is that even on this October morning, God has made a way back to him. There's a way back. For a while there wasn't. And the people walked around in darkness. God has said, in fact, I will be your God and you can be my people. I will be your shepherd and you can be my sheep. He has said that again. And so the promise in all this is that the gods no longer hold power over you. Oh, wow, I didn't even know they did, but that's pretty good news. You can come to God again freely through Jesus. But you have free will. And so I think as we move towards this communion table and a time of reflection and giving back to God through praise and worship, I do think we want to just consider maybe today we need personal renewal, or maybe today we need full-blown repentance. Doesn't matter. I don't care which R you want to insert and what you might need from Jesus today, but the point is, don't miss the moment. Don't miss the moment. Don't miss the moment because you have figured, like the Babylonians, that you can just take these pieces and build your own sacred space where you can be God and in charge. Don't let your pride build something that will ultimately scatter you from the presence of the true God. You know, God keeps renewing the promise, Eugene Peterson said in his translation of the Bible, Hebrews chapter 4. He said, God keeps renewing the promise. He keeps renewing the promise. He keeps renewing the promise. And setting the date is today, when the promise is still there. Fresh promise for you today. Fresh promise for you today. Fresh promise for you today. And he says, just as he did in David's psalm centuries later than the original invitation, today please listen and don't turn a deaf ear. He's renewed the promise, and it's today. Do you need renewal? Do you need repentance? Don't miss your moment.